My name is Grzegorz Ekierd. I'm professor of government and director of the Minda de Gunzburg Center for European Studies, and it's really my pleasure to warmly welcome Radoslaw Sikorski, the Speaker of the Polish Parliament. I'm delighted that we have you back here at Harvard, so it's our great pleasure. Thank you all for coming to this very special event. This lecture was organized by the Center for European Study in partnership with the Ukrainian Research Institute. This semester we have done together and worked on a number of events which were devoted to crisis in Ukraine. And I would like to thank Professor Serhiy Plokhy, the director of the Institute, for this perfect Europe-Ukraine collaboration. I would also like to thank the staff of the Center for European Studies for really exemplary work on this event. As you are all aware, this year we celebrate the 25th anniversary of the collapse of communist regimes across Eastern Europe and long-awaited reunification of Europe. We celebrated the June 4th elections in Poland, which resulted in the formation of the first non-communist government in the region. We celebrated the fall of the Berlin Wall with a series of events last week. There is an anniversary of the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia, and overthrow of Ceausescu regime anniversary is coming very soon. So it's particularly unsettling, if not utterly surrealistic, that during this year we see Russian troops and special forces on the march, that we witness military invasion and annexation of the territory of the sovereign European country, and the real armed conflict in Europe. Sometimes it feels like watching the third-ranking action movie, if not for the fact that thousands have died and lives of millions were disrupted, and carefully built political order in Europe has been challenged and tested. Now, while other discussions we had so far were devoted mostly to the causes of the crisis, today our focus is on the future and possible solutions to the crisis. And we couldn't imagine to have better speaker for this event, in part because Poland has been and emerged as the most successful country in the region, and the Ukraine has a potential to becoming the biggest disaster in the region. Now, Radoslaw Sikorski has been one of the most influential politicians in Europe, and as Poland's foreign affairs minister since 2007 until last September, he was the main architect of the EU policy vis-à-vis Eastern Europe. He was also personally involved in efforts to defuse the crisis from the very beginning with fellow ministers from Germany and France. He is currently the Speaker of the Polish Parliament and previously held many important positions in Polish government. He was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs, Deputy Minister of National Defense, and then longest-serving Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was educated at Oxford and spent 3 years in Washington as a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Radoslaw Sikorski's address is titled "The Future of Ukraine, Lessons from Poland." It's a great honor and privilege to welcome you to Harvard.
Thank you, Professor Ekierd. I'm always moved when people recall the year 1989. Bliss in that dawn was to be alive, but to be young was the very heaven. In 1989, in February, I was in Afghanistan, in Kabul, watching the last Soviet troops leave Afghanistan. By August, I was in Warsaw when the first non-communist government was being sworn in. In November, an American journalist called Anne Applebaum and myself, we got into a car and drove to watch the Berlin fall, the Berlin Wall fall. She's now Mrs. Sikorski. And we rounded off the year in Bucharest when Ceausescu was falling. So quite a few memories this year. But ladies and gentlemen, here in Harvard, On the 5th of June 1947, on the steps of the Memorial Church, momentous words were said, quote, "It is logical that the United States should do what it can to assist the return of normal economic health in the world, without which there can be no political stability and no assured peace. Our policy is not directed against any country, but against hunger, poverty, desperation, and chaos." End quote. US Secretary of State George Marshall set in motion the most profitable financial investment in human history, the reconstruction of Western Europe. The Marshall Plan was part of a wider Western ambition after World War II to create a world of rules. New global institutions were set up, led by US leadership and generosity, and with huge contributions from this university. The United Nations, the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, the International Court of Justice. Despite harsh Cold War ideological differences, these institutions took root. They grew and flourished. Why? Because the world, or at least the Western part of the world, had agreed that explicit international military aggression had to stop. Differences between peoples and nations should be settled by peaceful negotiation. The first principle of this world of rules was self-restraint. By cooperating, not fighting, we build a shared interest in success. Self-restraint, ruling out the war option, creates stability. Stability encourages investment. This creates innovation and new wealth. The European Economic Community was only one of many institutions which flourished under this regime. It grew and grew to become today's European Union, precisely because it was based on the principle of national political self-restraint. And success bred success. The second principle was that this world of rules was worth defending from those who didn't accept it. During the Cold War, this required a comprehensive Western approach, with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization at the heart. There were programs to share intelligence, especially among the English-speaking nations of the West, joint military exercises, exchanges of weapons and military technology. Institutions such as Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the BBC pushed back against communist lies and propaganda. So successful were these economic and security institutions, and so attractive to those who didn't enjoy them, that when the Warsaw Pact finally fell apart after 1989, the nations of Central Europe made it their national policy imperative to work closely with them or even apply to join them. Today I'm going to talk about two of those nations, Poland and Ukraine. They are, I believe, a textbook case of what works and what fails, and why. Between 1945 and 1989, both Poland and Ukraine were denied the chance to join the post-war economic boom in democratic Europe. Let's run the numbers and see what happened. Had Poland grown at the average rate of Germany and France between 1945 and 1990, it would have been 6 times richer when the Cold War ended. Think of the blighted lives and sheer miserable waste that statistic represents. Think of the countless long, cold hours my own family spent queuing for basic goods. When I was little, my grandfather was a particularly valued member of our family for all kinds of reasons, but also because as a pensioner, he had the time to stand in lines for staples for the entire family. Buying a refrigerator required queuing by rota for days. At the passport office, there were actually queue committees and official lists you had to sign at least once a day. For decades, Millions of people all over the Soviet bloc wasted large parts of their lives in this awful way. Finally, in 1990-91, communism collapsed under the weight of its own stupidity. Poland, Ukraine, Russia alike had a new chance to join the world of rules as normal democratic countries, to start to rebuild and grow. 25 years on, what do you see? Well, in 1990, Poland and Ukraine were both about equally poor and had a comparable GDP. Poland's GDP was $65 billion. $65 billion, the entire GDP of Poland. A miserable total for a European country of 40 million people. But we had two advantages. First, we knew what we wanted to leave behind. Second, we knew where we wanted to go. There was a collective national determination to do whatever it took to escape from socialism and instead to join mainstream Europe as a decent, free, successful country. This explains two key decisions taken back then, decisions whose wisdom is clear now. First, President Lech Wałęsa, the shipyard worker who changed the world, threw his personal prestige behind the radical, tough-love economic reform plan prepared by Deputy Prime Minister Leszek Balcerowicz. It caused pain. Savings were wiped out. Pensions were devalued, and whole industries became unprofitable. But it made a sharp, irreversible break with the past. The only way forward was up. Second, and I have to acknowledge this, former communist oppressors were made welcome in the new democratic process if they accepted the new Poland and its democratic principles. And by and large, they accepted the new rules. This released Poland's political and moral energy. All parties shared basic goals. They could and did compromise to take tough decisions in order to join Western institutions. Poland's steely collective will to succeed has paid off. And look where we are now. Our exports are now 11 times what they were then. Our GDP is more than doubled in constant prices, 8 times more in current prices. Our GDP per capita was just above 30% of EU average at that time. Now it's nearly 70%. Now look at Ukraine. Ukraine emerged as an independent state in late 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. It too had been held back by communism. But it had some important advantages, in fact. A strong industrial base, a defense industry, a space industry even, vast stretches of fertile soil, cheap electricity from nuclear power plants, and cheap gas, thanks to both its own resources and the Russia-Europe transit pipeline system, which ran beneath its territory. But Ukraine also had some key disadvantages. It had been a part of the Soviet Union since 1917 and a part of Tsarist Russia before that. Soviet legacy institutions and attitudes ran deep. There was little of a democratic tradition to inspire people. Many of Ukraine's best people, in fact, opted to stay on in Moscow and became Russian citizens. There was no Lech Wałęsa or anyone else with a moral authority to stand behind the economic transformation. Reforms got off to a slow start. Tough decisions were ducked. Above all, Ukraine failed at that time to join the world of rules. Instead of adopting the packages of reform laws needed to make a modern society work, Ukraine's elite preferred corrupt business and secret deals, often under intrigue and manipulation from a far wealthier and more powerful Russia. The comparison today between Poland and Ukraine is really stark. Basic numbers speak for themselves. Last year, Poland's nominal GDP passed $500 billion. Ukraine's is still far below 200 billion, and that's for a country with almost 20% more people than Poland. And this, I believe, the failure of modernization, helps to explain the current crisis in Ukraine. Ukrainians themselves see that Ukraine hasn't followed Poland's example. They see their country underperforming, missing out on the prosperity and stability that comes with joining fully the European branch of the world of rules. Now, for the second time, Ukrainians have taken to the streets in huge numbers to reject discredited leaders and discredited policies. They want reform and a clear sense of direction. They want to make up for 20 years of lost time and missed opportunities. They know that it means a momentous national choice. Pain now for gain later. It means adopting tried and proven IMF adjustment programs. It means that energy prices need to move to world levels. You just can't create a competitive economy when your households and industry cover only 20% of the market price of gas. Because the shortfall has to be covered by subsidies that eat up great chunks of your national budget and horribly skew your national resource decisions. For years, the International Monetary Fund have urged Ukraine's leaders to start moving to more realistic energy prices, offering schemes to help poorer citizens during the transition. For years, those leaders wouldn't listen to sensible arguments aimed at making Ukraine's energy sector less wasteful. Simple things like installing household gas meters or insulating homes. Successive Ukrainian prime ministers personally told me that they would do what's right as soon as they win the next election. And then they didn't. Second, it means implementing the association agreement with the European Union, with its anti-corruption procedures, legal norms, and European technical standards. As Poland shows, no country need go through this alone. Ukraine needs friends and supporters, and it has them. The European Union and the United States and the world's financial institutions stand ready to help. In April, Ukraine unveiled a comprehensive program of economic reforms backed by a 17 billion two-year loan approved by the IMF's executive board. The loan aims to restore macroeconomic stability, strengthen economic governance, and launch economic growth while protecting vulnerable groups. Ukraine has already received 4.6 billion of this loan. The European Bank for Reconstruction and Development is launching a special Ukraine stabilization account and planning to engage $1.3 billion this year alone. And as you know, Ukraine has been the focus of both the G20 meeting in Brisbane and last Monday's Foreign Affairs Council in Brussels. But help for Ukraine has to come with the usual tough love conditions on transparency and good governance. Poland has had plenty of this nasty-tasting conditionality medicine. That's why we are in such a strong shape today. We'll do what we can to help Ukraine take its dose too. After 2 wasted decades, Ukraine's journey to succeed and growth would have been difficult enough, even under benign conditions. But as we all know, Ukraine does not have benign conditions. The events in Crimea and eastern Ukraine are dramatic and dangerous. They threaten Ukraine's stability, and they pose a new kind of test for the transatlantic alliance that was set up to protect the West and its rules. Let me demolish, on the record, an assertion which is heard quite often, both in Moscow and in Western capitals, that the Ukraine crisis has somehow been provoked by Western governments in general and by the US or NATO in particular. As few now seem to remember, when the Cold War ended, the transatlantic team of North America and Western Europe welcomed Central and Eastern European countries into modern democratic society. But the impetus for NATO enlargement did not come from a triumphalist Washington. On the contrary, the United States initially resisted even the breakup of the Soviet Union. It's true that since 1990, 12 European states have asked to join NATO, but they all chose for themselves to belong to this cooperative military alliance. NATO membership was a key part of locking in their turbulent democratic reforms. NATO programs helped modernize our armed forces and bring them fully under civilian control. NATO played a vital role in helping all these countries make a clear break from secret communist-era military intelligence machinations, right at the heart of supposedly independent states. While this slow, cautious, and, as I remember, reluctant enlargement did eventually take place, constant efforts were made to reassure Russia. Russia was welcomed to the Council of Europe, to the World Trade Organization, and given closer relations with the European Union. No substantial NATO bases were ever placed in the new member states. Until 2013, 14 years after our membership in NATO, no NATO military exercises were ever conducted in Poland, Baltic states, or anywhere else on the eastern flank. No nuclear installations have been moved to the territory of new member states, even though Russia has her own nuclear installations less than 100 kilometers from Poland's border. A NATO-Russia Council was set up, and Russia was promised that as long as she respected borders in Europe, no substantial combat forces would be moved east. Largely in response to Russian objections, Ukraine and Georgia were in fact denied NATO membership in 2008 at the Bucharest NATO summit. In pressing the reset button with Moscow towards Russia, President Obama changed the configuration of the proposed missile defense installation in Poland and then suspended its phase 4, which Russia disliked. In short, the assertion that Russia was humiliated during this period is ridiculous. Russia took charge of all the former Soviet nuclear weapons, some transferred from Ukraine in 1994, when Russia recognized Ukraine's borders, including Crimea. Ukraine's territorial integrity was guaranteed in the Budapest Memorandum by Russia, United States, United Kingdom, and France. Presidents Clinton and Bush treated their Russian counterparts as fellow great power leaders and invited them to join the G7, even though Russia did not qualify this group at that time, either as a large economy or as a stable democracy. The US spent billions of dollars working with Russia to reduce Cold War nuclear and chemical weapons stocks and to achieve new, better arms control agreements. All sorts of smaller, practical projects have been set up with Russia. The NATO-Russia Cooperative Airspace Initiative aims to prevent aircraft hijackings. We have agreed to help destroy the dangerous ammunition stocks in the Kaliningrad exclave. Russia has benefited from all these programs, as have we, and many more. Freed from decades of self-inflicted communism, Russia has joined the global economy as a normal country, and it has seen the benefits. Russia's GDP was a feeble 570 billion in 1990, $570 billion. By 2013, Russia's GDP has grown to $2.1 trillion. So, in the years following the end of the Cold War, did NATO and EU governments show unwavering hostility towards Russia? Did we cynically take advantage of Russia's weakness? Have we been humiliating Russia? I answer those three questions in 3 words. No, no, and no. The record since the Berlin Wall came down shows NATO and the European Union and their individual member states all working hard and in good faith to build normal, purposeful relations with Russia. And it shows that Russia itself benefiting hugely from this relationship. Poland has played its part in this historic Western effort to normalize relations with Moscow. Down the centuries, Poland's relations with Russia have been long and dramatic. We remember our grievances all too well. Over a century of partitions, attack on Poland in 1939 together with Hitler, 45 years of communism. The Russians have their memories too. They have just celebrated on November 4th their Unity Day, which replaced the anniversary of the October Revolution under the USSR. Unity Day commemorates a popular uprising in 1612, which ejected Polish occupiers from the Kremlin. At the end of it, the ashes of a Polish-supported usurper was loaded into a cannon and shot back towards Warsaw. It was largely a private expedition, but in the course of it, our ancestors did burn down Moscow. But when the Cold War ended, Warsaw and Moscow made efforts together to put things on a good track. President Yeltsin threw away one of the greatest lies ever told by the Soviet Union about Poland. He acknowledged that it was Stalin who was responsible in 1940 for the mass murder of some 20,000 Polish prisoners of war in the Katyn forest and elsewhere. Though it took a few years, Soviet troops finally left Poland. In recent years, Poland has made a systematic effort to improve relations with Russia. As foreign minister, I relaunched a joint commission on Polish-Russian history. We negotiated a border arrangement that allows Russian citizens living in the Kaliningrad district to travel back and forth to Poland, which is to say, a part of the European Union, with ease. We expanded trade and business contacts, and there was marked improvement. In 2009, President Putin came to Poland on the 70th anniversary of the outbreak of the Second World War. This was the first time that a Russian leader had acknowledged that World War II began in September 1939 with the Nazi-Soviet invasion of Poland, and not, as Stalinist historiography would have it, in 1941 when Hitler attacked the USSR. In 2010, President Putin was in fact the first Russian leader to pay respects to our murdered officers at Katyn. Our churches published a joint letter in the spirit of mutual forgiveness and reconciliation. Should we regret doing all this? Of course not. Good faith moves to build new areas of cooperation and opportunity. This is what diplomacy is all about. So, where has it all gone wrong? The basic problem is that the current leadership in Moscow depends on corrupt business structures and media manipulation to keep power. The Russian elite is dominated by former KGB officers who, starting in the late 1980s, used Russian state money, sometimes laundered through Western offshore banks, to purchase land, natural resources, and property on a vast scale. To protect this wealth, they must prevent the outbreak of a democratic revolution of the kind that shook Central Europe after 1989, or an anti-corruption revolution, as took place in Kiev's Maidan Square early this year. Using military invasions of Georgia and now Ukraine, or strong-arm tactics as in Armenia, or corrupt proxies in Moldova, they seek to stop nations of the former Soviet Union from daring to join the successful institutions of the West, and from setting an example that Russians might want to follow. They are playing games with our public opinion through propaganda tricks. Paid internet trolls pollute our newspaper comment pages, Twitter, Facebook, and other sites. They roll out fake experts with fake authority. They try to legitimize extreme political forces of all kinds, paying for far-left anti-American rhetoric on their English language Russia Today channel, while simultaneously supporting far-right anti-Europe politicians in Europe. Not content with that, they are testing our very military resolve. Russian planes buzz American, Swedish, Danish, even Canadian planes. Russian troops have captured an Estonian security officer working on the Estonian side of the border. Russian Navy captured a Lithuanian fishing boat and held it for ransom. All these obnoxious ploys are intended to nibble away at Western resolve and our own and wider faith in NATO Article 5, to test the value of our mutual security guarantees. But also, as events this year in Ukraine have shown, to challenge head-on the most basic rule of international law and the world of rules, that international borders cannot be changed by force. The international response to Russia's policies has been restrained. It has been designed to raise the cost to Russia of undermining Western institutions. The policy is working up to a point. Russia's president has just admitted that the price his country is paying is high. Let's run the numbers again. In the decade from 2002 to 2012, Russia's economy grew on average by 5% per year. Russia, like Poland, was integrating with the global economy and seeing very positive results. If Russia were to grow at the same rate from now until 2025, its GDP would be, in 2025, $3.7 trillion, up from today's $2.1 trillion. If instead Russia grows at only 1% over the next decade, which seems to be the case this year, because of sanctions and because of global mistrust of its intentions, its GDP in 2025 will be far less, $2.3 trillion. Therefore, cumulatively, over the decade, Russia will have lost the staggering sum of over $8 trillion. Its leaders have decided to gamble with their own citizens' lives and hopes by looking to the past, not the future. Some of Russia's citizens are wondering whether this enormous price is worth paying and what Russia is getting for it. Tens of thousands of Russians marched recently in a march against the war in Ukraine. A small number, but far more than the 8 brave people who dared demonstrate in Moscow in 1968 against the Soviet Union's invasion of Czechoslovakia. They are not the only ones who are asking whether it's worth hundreds of billions of dollars to fly the Russian flag over the impoverished Crimean Peninsula. Is it worth hundreds of billions of dollars so that criminals and mercenaries can destroy Ukraine's Donbas region? How many Russian soldiers have died or been seriously injured in Ukraine? Russian families would like to know. They want to know what's happening. Maybe Russia's leaders too are starting to conclude that this price is not worth paying. I truly hope they do. But we need to be prepared if they don't. at least in the short term. We need to think hard about the health of those institutions we set up half a century ago. First and foremost, we need to face a grim reality. Hard, sharp security questions are being posed to us in Europe once again. The NATO that we have now is not the NATO we need to deal with these challenges. If we were starting from scratch now, nobody would put NATO troops and equipment where they are now. NATO should shut down unnecessary commands and legacy bases and get back to its primary mission, deterrence. NATO is a defensive alliance, but for deterrence to work, our military capability has to look and be serious. Second, follow the money. Have we been complacently turning a blind eye to an uncomfortable truth that our own tangled, over-complex banking systems have been exploited by international semi-criminal networks, not only from Russia, but from all over the world? Simply by enforcing existing money laundering laws and asking hard questions about murky money, we will help ourselves and help others who are trying, against high odds, to join the world of rules. Peoples around the world would be empowered, and kleptocrats would be restrained if only we implemented existing laws. Third, we need to think hard about how Europe and the United States work together in Ukraine and other countries wanting our help. It's demoralizing for them that so much Western money is wasted through duplication and institutional jostling for position. Swedish technical assistant agencies and Dutch or American technical assistant agencies shouldn't be duplicating or contradicting one another's programs. Technical expert advice works best when supported by pragmatic peer-to-peer consultations. Ukrainian ministers turn to us, to Polish counterparts, to ask what we think. They say, you Poles have been through this. What do you think makes sense? We try our best to tell them. Here in Harvard today, we honor the memory and leadership of George Marshall. Back in 1947, Ukraine, like Poland, was blocked by Stalin from taking part in those generous programs that he launched. Let's help Ukraine now, when at last she is free to ask for and ready to receive our help. The principled way out of this crisis is based on all sides returning to the principles that George Marshall articulated right here in Harvard. Teamwork, cooperation, Russia's return to the world of rules. If this happens, sanctions can be lifted. Russia can again participate normally in international financial markets and institutions. All Russia's grievances concerning Ukraine or anywhere else can be tackled sensibly and fairly through the United Nations, OSCE, Council of Europe, or other fora created for precisely such problems. Moscow itself asked to join these organizations when it wasn't a founder partner. Moscow itself has pledged to respect their rules. Let's be very clear here in Harvard today what is at stake in Ukraine. The alternative to working through these issues normally and peacefully in a spirit of successful partnership is a new dividing line across the European continent. It won't be made of iron, but it'll be real enough. On one side of the line, countries and peoples free to choose their own democratic destiny. On the other side, countries in a decaying twilight zone, a blighted, unhappy, unstable place outside the world of rules. If we get this wrong, our shared Western decades-long strategic ambition to create a Europe whole and free will falter. I have stood in Kiev with ordinary Ukrainians demonstrating for the right to live decently and peacefully. They want only what we Poles now have, to move on from drab oppression and start being successful, to be a part of the Western family of nations led by this country, the USA. Ukrainians under terrible pressure have voted this year, twice. They have voted for the values that this university represents. They have voted overwhelmingly for pluralism and honesty in domestic politics, for respect for minorities, cooperation with neighbors, and association with the European Union. The values that have helped Poland achieve such success in the past two decades. These values can in turn bring success to Ukraine and, yes, to Russia too. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for this very important address. Minister Sikorski agreed to answer questions from the audience. Let me set up the rules of the game. We have two mics here, which are unfortunately stationary mics. So if you would like to ask a question, please line up behind the microphones. And if I could ask you to, first of all, state your name, be relatively brief in question you ask, and of course keep within the broad theme of our today's meeting. Please.
Oleg Kutsuba, Department of Slavic Languages and Literatures and Journal Kritika. I mostly wanted to ask you about the strain that the crisis in Ukraine has put onto the relationships that Poland has with France and Germany. And we know that Poland has been very active in the beginning of the crisis, negotiating, but now we see mostly Germany and Angela Merkel and Steinmeier negotiating the issues of the conflict in the east of Ukraine with Moscow directly, and Poland is mostly squeezed out, it feels, of this process. Could you maybe expand on this a little bit? Thank you.
Should we take a few in turn, or shall I go right away? Well, look, we support all efforts to help the situation. There has been a transition at the European level. We've elected a new parliament, we've selected a new European Commission, the new head of the European Council, Prime Minister Tusk, hasn't, in fact, taken over yet. So there was room for some national diplomacy during this transition period. But I believe it would be most efficacious to go back to the European level and for Europe as a whole to try to negotiate with President Putin. Personally, I thought the Geneva format was the best because it included all the stakeholders: Russia, Ukraine, the European Union, and the United States. Because the current attempts haven't succeeded yet.
Mr. Sikorski, you, in your speech, you describe Poland as a model for other democracies like Ukraine with our reforms since the fall of communism back in 1989. And the question is, what example are we setting for the boring democracy in Ukraine, fixing elections in Poland? As you know, we're having elections these days, or we had last Sunday. For example, I tell the audience that in one of major cities in Poland, Szczecin, a guy who wasn't even on the ballot won the election. It's the mayor now of Szczecin. How you explain this?
I haven't heard this, but the audience might not be entirely clear about what you're referring to. Yes, it's true that last weekend we had a local election, and yes, a computer system designed to compute all the votes, not to count them, but to compute votes, failed. And the Electoral Commission has now gone to manual counting of votes. It's a technical hitch, but of no consequence in the long run.
Thank you very much for answer, but I would like to notice that 80% of your election committee, you know, those people sitting in the election bar, counting votes, etc., they are communist judges from 70s setting tough sentences on democratic opposition leaders back in 70s in Poland, and also solidarity leaders.
Let's have this internal Polish discussion in Poland.
That's right. Yeah. Okay. So thank you so much.
You said that Ukraine has friends, including the United States. But not long ago, when you were foreign minister, it was reported that you said off the record, but it came on the record, that Poland's relation with the United States wasn't worth anything. So will Ukraine find out that alliance with the United States is worthless too?
Well, I'm surprised that you would quote from illegally taped
the BBC and other reputable
conversations that I'm not going to comment. They're subject to prosecution in which I'm named as a victim of criminals.
My name is Radoslaw Sikorski, and I'm the one who paid for fighting with regime. I was in prison. I'm here because my government kicked me out with my little kids with passport one way only. And you're telling you have been in Ukraine, you have been in Kyiv. Can you tell us what happened in Kyiv? What you told to the Ukrainian people when they are very struggle? What did you tell them? Can you tell them? Can you tell this to the audience? Sir, it's very easy to have a piece of paper and read the numbers. This is not how we are doing. That part, what I fight, when I spent in jail, leaving my kids home, it's not the democracy what is here in Poland right now.
Could you ask, please, the question?
Yeah, I asked.
Sure. So
what
is
Mr. Sikorski told to the Ukrainian people, if they are not going to take that deal, then you're going to be dead.
Thank you so much.
Well, I think I know what the lady is referring to. It's true that it was a very tense moment in Ukraine's history. I arrived in Kiev literally on the day when President Yanukovych started using snipers against demonstrators. On the day that we negotiated the deal between President Yanukovych and the opposition, 100 people were killed, literally outside the windows of the presidential palace, in which we, the three ministers of Poland, Germany, and France, were helping the two sides to make an agreement. We were just witnesses. And yes, it's true that if the opposition failed to agree, we now know that President Yanukovych was prepared to use even more force to try to break the will of the demonstrators. So I'm glad that the Council of the Maidan accepted the agreement by, I believe, 35-2 in a vote, after Minister Steinmeier and myself told them what the alternative would be. The deal, as you know, unraveled pretty quickly, but it stopped the killing, and it led to the flight of President Yanukovych from Kiev.
Thank you, please.
Hi, I'm Sam Montalivi at the graduate school. You talked a little bit about RT and some of the kind of information wars, misinformation coming out of Russia. How do you think governments in the West can respond to that sort of strategy?
Well, certainly not by doing the same backwards. I believe that we need to create the kinds of news sources that would be credible for the peoples of the Soviet Union in their own languages. I'm not sure we need to create large organizations with broadcasting capabilities and so on. But if we supported a bit of investigative reporting of high quality, it might empower honest Russian, Ukrainian, Belarusian journalists to do what's right. You know, our own media are in crisis too, and that requires reflection. But we also need to enforce our regulations. You know, in Britain, for example, I don't know the laws in this country, but in Britain, I believe RT has been warned that it's breaching the rules of fair reporting, and that might mean, as far as I know, that its license isn't that. Well,
Madam.
Yes, Celestine Bolin at the Shorenstein Center. I just wanted to know about the sanctions, whether you think it was realistic to expect that the sanctions that were brought against Russia, in particular those against the inner circle around Putin, were actually going to change the behavior of Russia in Ukraine. And if you do, what evidence do you have to date that that's actually had any effect?
Well, as I mentioned in my speech, it's President Putin who is saying that the sanctions are inconveniencing
But I'm asking
Russia.
whether it's changing his behavior.
Well, the trouble with sanctions is that, first of all, they hurt both sides. And Poland is actually hurting more than others because we're closer, and trade with Russia is a much bigger proportion of our trade than yours or even Germany's. But sanctions work in the medium term, whereas we need to affect behavior in the short term. And the record of sanctions affecting the behavior of governments is on the whole not great. But it's the only thing we have to express our disapproval and to try to persuade Russian leaders to change course. If you have any other ideas, please let us have them.
The only thing is, if it doesn't change the behavior, then is it in fact in our interests to actually sort of hurt the Russian economy, to sort of change their course, pushing them to Asia?
Well, as I say, sanctions unfortunately hurt both sides. But they do create some deterrence, I think, from going further.
Thank you, ma'am.
Sir.
My name is Alex Zell. I'm a visiting fellow in the Department of Government, originally from Humboldt University, Berlin. First of all, I want to say I'm a great admirer of your work and follow it very closely, and I was actually hoping to see you here as part of the new European Commission. One thing you said about the comparison between Ukraine and Poland I found very interesting, and that was that Ukraine was profiting from highly subsidized energy prices, and that you were saying that Poland were facing austerity after quitting the Soviet influence and having to face this austerity, and Ukraine didn't have to face the austerity. The question, though, is did Poland at the time have another option? And now, if we're looking at Ukraine, as long as Ukraine has the option, are they really going to face the austerity? And if they can't rely anymore on the highly subsidized energy prices, who is going to jump in and cover the cost?
These are two excellent questions. You're quite right. We were helped in 1990 because we were a basket case even by the standards of communist Central Europe. Our inflation rate was 800% in 1990, and we were bankrupt, literally. We were not servicing our foreign obligations. But that also means that it should be easier for Ukraine because they are not bankrupt and they do not have hyperinflation. You know, this is a paradox that sometimes it's amazing what you can do when you have to. And your second point is a fair one too, that if Ukraine makes its energy priced at the world levels, the competitiveness of some parts of its economy will drop. But some clever things can be done here too. For example, you know, Poland doesn't have a nuclear power industry. We're considering building a couple of power stations, but we haven't done it yet. Ukraine has, I'm told, about a 50% surplus in its base load of electricity from nuclear power stations. And we have a huge interconnector, electricity interconnector. You know, what a great idea to link the two systems, allow Ukraine to earn some hard currency, and for Poland to have competitively priced energy without having to invest 100 billion euros or whatever it costs to build these facilities. So, you know, once you allow the market to operate, people will find interesting solutions to these problems.
Sir. My name is Wojciech Suchicki. I came to the United States in 1966 as a 12-year-old boy. And I can relate to your comment, Minister Sikorski, about the lines in Poland. Because I used to write to my friends that the only lines you waited in the United States was to pay and check out. You didn't have to wait for product. So that's the difference. And it's refreshing to see now, when you visit Poland, that
we also waited the US consulate in Warsaw, you know.
Very good. Well, people still want to come here. But if we work on the visa restrictions, I think things will change. And just a question for you. How much European dependence on Russian energy influences some of the decisions that are being made in these situations?
Good question. But let's remember the basic facts. Europe, in fact, is not that dependent on energy supply from any one direction. Europe is essentially, and I'm talking about gas, because oil is fungible. You can just buy it on the market and have it delivered anywhere you want. So it's pipeline delivered gas that is the issue. And actually, it's about a third from the North Sea, about a third from North Africa, and about a third from Russia. And I believe we've drawn the right lessons from the previous Ukraine cutoff, and we've now built more storage facilities, more gas interconnectors. Poland is about, literally, in the next few months, to start using its LNG terminal. And so not only can we help, in most cases, can we help one another within the EU with gas supplies, we can even help Ukraine with gas reversals. So I don't believe it's a big issue. It might be a psychological issue in some countries, because some countries are not dependent on Russian gas. They are dependent, if you like, on the profits from trading Russian gas, but that's not the same thing.
Thank you very much.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, my name is Marcel Garbosch, and I'm in the History Department. You discussed in great detail the levels of economic prosperity and transparency produced by Polish reform since the early 1990s. But I would be curious to hear a bit more about what, if any, lessons you think Poland could provide to Ukraine in terms of the reduction of socioeconomic inequality, especially given the former country's current predicaments with labor relations, unemployment, and distribution of wealth. I think the percentage of people living in absolute poverty, skromna bieda, has increased quite significantly in the last 10 years. So I would be curious.
Well, I would suggest you check the numbers, because in fact the levels of poverty and the Gini coefficient, I think it's called, it has improved markedly in Poland. And so actually it's a textbook example that doing economic reforms lifts up people from poverty. Poland is not only richer, it's also less unequal than Ukraine. In Ukraine, I'm told the majority of the economy is owned by about 80 individuals. In Russia, I read the statistic, I can't tell you where from exactly, but it sounds right. About a third of the national wealth is owned by 110 individuals. So you see these kleptocratic oligarchical systems are also create societies that are less fair. Poland is richer and fairer.
Thank you.
Hello. Thank you very much for your speech. I would be interested because you mentioned...
Could you introduce yourself?
Oh, I'm Luisa van Richthofen. I'm a student at Wellesley College. And I would like to know your reaction in front of President Putin's recent rehabilitation of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in the context of the Ukraine crisis. Yeah.
Well, I don't think I even need to tell you what I think about it, because you can well guess.
Yeah.
Sir, thank you for your speech. My name is Marek Kowalski, and I am a medical student over at Boston University. So I was just wondering if you could quickly summarize what you, as the former Minister of Foreign Affairs from Poland, what you see as the most imperative changes that the Ukrainian government has itself to institute in order to speed up the integration with Europe.
I'm not sure exactly what you mean.
In terms of dealing with the corruption, let's say, that still exists, or undertaking some first, let's say, economical steps that you would think as.
Well, fighting corruption is a relatively simple business. You need to clean up the political elite first, and then it makes sure that the rest of the economy is cleaned up. And for that, you need statements of assets, you need register of interests, and you need punishments if somebody doesn't state the truth. And you need leadership from the top. You will never get it sorted out if the top man is not interested in cleaning up the system. It's early days yet, but I'm hoping that the new team in Ukraine does it, because corruption is the thing that alienates the citizen from the state. It's the corrosion that can destroy even the best economic plans. Because if rules of the game are skewed, if administration of justice is not impartial, then people will not invest. And if they don't invest, there is no success. In a sense, the Ukrainians have it easier, because we were moving into uncharted waters in 1990. And in fact, very few people thought that Poland would become this success story. Hungary had a better press. The Czech Republic had a memory of having been a more advanced economy before the war, and so on. For Ukraine, it's easier only in the sense that the plan is there. You just need to implement the IMF program and implement the association agreement, because the anti-corruption law is actually part of the process to abolish visas for Ukrainians. Just do it. Translate it all into Ukrainian through parliament, implement it honestly, and it will be done.
Thank you. Derek Barsikowski, Wide Eagle Media. Mr. Sikorski, you mentioned that the economic sanctions are taking a toll on Russia, but we have still seen a tremendous military buildup on the border over the last couple of weeks. How do you envision the path forward for the European Union and the United States if the sanctions and diplomacy ultimately fail to stop Russia?
Well, I don't have the numbers on the military buildup. I don't think it's anything like what we saw at the peak. So it's difficult actually to interpret what's going on. But I hope the new leadership of the European Union find a way to persuade President Putin to start cooperating again, because further military activity would not be good for Ukraine, but it would be bad for Russia too. Nobody has some kind of magic formula. We can only appeal to the Russian leadership's patriotism for Russia's true interests.
Thank you.
Oh, good evening. I'm Lieutenant Colonel Stan Jeski, retired United States Army. And I'd like to tell you about a story. I happened to be in the U.S. Army during the Berlin crisis. And I was stationed in Heidelberg. And I got this message from the command staff. It said Orange Scarlet. And I, of course, translated that message. And it said, prepare for general war. And I go, oh my God, here we are. We're going to be killing Europeans again. And I'm going to be killing Polish people, Polish soldiers at the time. So how was this resolved? Well, President Kennedy, through diplomacy, talked to Khrushchev. He just, I guess, the negotiation was to take the missiles out of Turkey. And then everything, was kind of peaceful after that.
Oh, so you mean the Cuban crisis?
It happened to be the Cuban crisis, right, in 1962. But there again, we avoided a nuclear war. I mean, I was a nuclear weapons guy, but on top of being in the Corps of Engineers building things. But, you have a serious situation here again, And I'm afraid that President Obama doesn't have the diplomatic skills, to call up Putin or somebody, And I know, the IMF is doing things, but I'm not so sure. I mean, they made an agreement to give a certain amount of funds to the Ukraine, but in return, they want to GMO all of that vast agricultural land in Ukraine. What kind of deal is that? That's all that's going to do is do another hullabaloo. What was where 12 million Ukrainians were starved to death? They're going to starve themselves in a different manner.
I'm afraid I've lost you there.
No, I know you want to get into that, but I think that Poland's got to spearhead a negotiation with Russia too, or be involved in it. And I mean, right now it seems to be a stalemate, and I'm not sure what the solution is. I mean, diplomats ought to be able to put something together.
I agree with you that we should keep channels of communication open with Russia, and that diplomacy is particularly necessary in a crisis.
Well, many commented on the current crisis as the first case in history since World War II that territory was annexed. That is the case of the Crimea and Eastern Europe as well. And what we saw with the Budapest Memorandum of '94, with guarantors, US, France, and Britain of Ukrainian integrity, again, that piece of paper didn't matter much. So many are talking today about the not just threat to the international order, but actually destruction of international order and security system in Europe. as it existed before. So I wonder what is your assessment of that, whether the order still exists, or if it has to be rebuilt, what would be the way to rebuild it? Maybe a new security conference in Europe with the participation of US and Russia. So what would be the way to deal with this crisis as a crisis of international order? Thank you.
Well, the best way to rebuild it would be for Russia to restore Ukraine's territorial integrity. But you're right that it's a very bad precedent to have failed to uphold the Budapest Memorandum, because Ukraine voluntarily gave up, I think it was the second nuclear stockpile in Europe at the time. It was bigger than UK's or France's at the time, voluntarily. And you know, there are countries today that we are trying to voluntarily give up nuclear ambitions in return for security guarantees. And you know, the people in Pyongyang and Tehran are probably following this stuff. And so I don't think it's a good precedent. And you're also right that once deterrence has been challenged and seen at the edges failing, it's very difficult to restore it. Because the entire post-war, this world of rules that I've been talking about, was undergirded by the assumption of US invincibility and US presence in Europe. And the US now no longer has a single tank in Europe. And as we learned during both the first Gulf War and the second Gulf War, it takes some months to move US forces across the Atlantic. So I hope that the decisions that were taken at the Newport NATO summit in September are just the beginning, that we need to conclude, unfortunately, that the times of spending the peace dividend are over, and we need to do what Russia has done, not on the same scale, but we need to start increasing our defense budgets, unfortunately.
Michael Popielek, I have no affiliation with Harvard. Looking at the actions, 2 years ago, Russia invaded Georgia. Recently, they have taken over Crimea.
No, not 2 years ago. That was 2008.
Okay, I apologize. 6 years ago, then. I suppose there wasn't really a response. Hence, Putin felt emboldened and more arrogant. He went after Crimea. Again, he feels quite safe, I think, and secure, and went on to take other territories of Ukraine. What is the red line for NATO? When does he cross it? Is my first question. And second question, in your opinion, if Poland was invaded, how long as a standalone can it fight off and withhold Russian invasion? I know there's been increase in budget spent on protecting and Polish military, but that won't be really practical and won't be ready to use for the next several years. So in current state.
Well, good, tough questions. We are holding President Obama to his word in June this year in Poland that Poland will never have to fight alone again. And as regards NATO red line, well, that's been stated very clearly. The NATO red line is on the NATO border. Security guarantees apply to members.
And the other question, please. In terms of how long do you think Poland could withstand the Russian invasion for before we got any help?
That's a fascinating question, but I don't think I want to discuss it publicly as a former defense minister.
Hi, my name is Nestor. I'm a sophomore at the college, and part of the readings that I've done, at least, have sort of ascertained the fact that, like, part of the difficulty with Russia is the fact that they sort of have this capitalist authoritarian style of government, that, you know, is very human rights abusing. Like, there's a lot of issues with that. But more importantly, like, it sort of creates this centralized authority structure in which people like Putin can get away with a lot of things that they're doing. And part of the way you can actually change that, and part of the way you actually change regimes, you know, in a lot of these places that would make things better for a lot of these Western nations, is you sort of mobilize like local support. Like you talked about Solidarność in Poland, how, you know, there was a local incentive to actually do something, to actually incite change, and as a result, you had Poland moving in a lot better place. So my question, sort of knowing that information, is there anything that Western, or more specifically European nations, can do to sort of mobilize, like, you know, support, at least in like Russia, local support that, you know, tries to change things democratically? Or, you know, better question perhaps, is that even a priority? Like, do European nations care about, like, you know, the X number of thousand protesters who sort of, you know, take up arms in Moscow like every other year to sort of fight for more democracy? Like, is there an incentive to do anything?
Contrary to what Russian leadership thinks, we are not in the business of fomenting revolution in Russia. The Russian people themselves have to decide what form of government they want and how they go about their business. We are just disappointed that, I'm disappointed that the plan that Vladimir Putin sketched out when he first became prime minister for a holistic modernization of Russia, which is to say, empowering Russian societies, building these civil institutions by Russians, for Russians, at Russia's pace, without our interference, that plan seems to have been shelved. It's just a shame, but it's the Russian people that have to decide about this, not us.
My name's Paul O'Hara. I'm a sophomore at the college. And I was just wondering, what do you think President Putin's kind of like end goals, or what do you think he hopes to accomplish in foreign policy through like his actions in Ukraine and the Crimea region?
Well, I think President Putin is actually very honest with us. You just need to read the Russian national security doctrine or President Putin's annexation speech in March this year, and it's all there laid out in detail. The philosophy and the doctrine of gathering the lands that were ever a part of Russia or where Russian people or Russian speakers live. And of course, it's a doctrine that we can't accept because, you know, imagine if other countries adopted a similar doctrine, you know, United Kingdom or Mongolia. Right. We would be in deep trouble.
Thank you.
Questions? If I may jump in. Your vision of new Marshall Plan for Ukraine, how feasible it is, given the deteriorating economic situation in Ukraine. We know at this point that all the estimates of IMF and World Bank were too optimistic, that the deterioration is much faster and much deeper than we thought before. And of course, Europe goes through a very difficult period economically. Do you think, is it possible to have solidarity tax imposed in Europe or voted in Europe to help Ukraine? Where the resources could come from in, you know, saving the Ukrainian economy, and then, you know, on the top of this to try to rebuild and move Ukrainian economy in the right direction?
Let me preface, but what I'm going to say by going slightly out of area. Because if you look at Europe's neighborhood, we are actually in trouble. Never in my political memory has the environment of Europe been so troubled, both in the East and particularly in the South. And we had high hopes to do with Arab Spring, but it hasn't exactly worked out. Largely because of the nature of those societies, but also because for all kinds of institutional and political reasons, we were not able to marshal sufficient resources fast enough to help the good guys, the Democrats in Syria, Egypt, Libya, you name it. And my thesis is that however troubled Ukraine looks today, I can imagine a set of steps which leads to Ukraine being in 5 or 10 years' time a successful country. Much more so than I can imagine Syria or Libya being a successful country. So what I'm saying to you is that in spite of everything, it's in the east of Europe that the EU can still have a success. And such a success is worth something. And I'm not asking for some new institutional framework for Ukraine, because I believe that tough love is what the doctor orders, which is to say it has to be conditional, month by month, tranches released only when benchmarks are met. But as you say, conditions are now different from what they were when the IMF assistance package was being agreed. Much worse, because Ukraine has been invaded. And here we should show flexibility, provided the Ukrainians do their bit, provided they do the right thing, start really implementing reforms, demonopolizing their economy, fighting corruption, creating competitive structures. We can be more generous from the IMF or World Bank funds that are available.
Please join me to thank Minister Sikorski for this address and discussion.